Skibidi Toilet Humanity Flushed Volume 1 by Shiro Yasha. The day was one of tremendous trenchant. The skies over Tokyo began their nightly fade to sunset, but a blackened blight had already descended upon the metropolis' hapless residents and indeed those of the rest of the world. The skyscrapers in Shibuya Crossing interiors all razed and windows blown out, with the rest of the megacity not faring any better. Joint United States military and Japanese self-defense forces, now depleted and ragged, continued their stand against the strange and disturbing invasion. American M270A1 MLRS armored tracked vehicles, accompanied by Japanese Type 10 tanks, chugged their way through the surrounding wreckage, chalking the streets as they bore down on the titanic, glistening white porcelain toilet before them hovering in the sky. These were the invaders. These strange creatures, toilets with heads atop elongated necks, ranging in size from your average toilet to colossal titans the size of buildings. The only form of language or form of communication they have is repeating in distorted audio the phrase Skibidi Dom, yes, yes, earning them the moniker that they have become known as the Skibidi Toilets. But the most disturbing attribute of these creatures was if they bite you, you transform and become one of them, or so is theorized. As Skibidi toilets performing several human functions, such as police, have been documented. Some intelligence has even suggested that they have turned or overthrown the world governments, and what is left of the world's armed forces are now acting on their own with no higher orders. The M270A1 MLRSs now stopped their launchers, rose up, and swivel right into position, aiming at the Titan toilet in the center of the crossing. Russian Mi-24P Hind-F helicopters circled behind. These helicopters were controlled by the toilets, as the distinctive double-bubble cockpit was replaced by a large toilet. Smoke and screeching erupted as a cluster of 12 rockets left each vehicle. The rockets slammed into the Titan toilet, consuming it in a covering of fire and smoke. The fiery flashes of secondary explosions could be seen erupting underneath the cover of the thick black smoke. Echoing mechanical-sounding groans bellowed out of the smoke as the American and Japanese forces awaited to see the outcome of their assault. Then from under the covering of smoke, a spinning object. It twisted and swirled the smoke as it neared the epicarp of the smoke. Slow spinning rotor blades breached the smoke, followed by the remains of the Mi-24P Hind-F firelight glowing and flickering inside, lapping out the back where the aircraft's tail section once was. The hull of the aircraft spun counter to the rotor blades as it came crashing down, blasting out into a huge fireball and skidding in front of the human vehicles. As the smoke dissipated, the Titanic toilet still towered there. The remains of more toilet cockpitted helicopters thrashed and burning on the ground as the others turned to face the threat. The face of the Titan toilet turned to rage, his large, square, short black hair with a touch of gray, thick eyebrows, powerful chin, and sunken aged cheeks reminiscent of former United States President Ronald Reagan. His mouth opened and a distorted bellowing echoing "Skibidi, Skibidi" belched out. He was the Skibidi toilet leader, and he was not pleased. His head swiveled and aimed. The Type 10 tanks opened fire to no avail. The Skibidi leader emanated lasers from his eyes, obliterating the tanks and MLRSs that tried to oppose him. Gunfire from the surviving helicopters raked the area where the remains of the American and Japanese vehicles came to lay. The helicopters then touched down, disembarking their toiletry troopers. "Skibidi, Skibidi, Skibidi," they all echoed out. The surviving and wounded humans started to try and escape, some running, others trying to provide covering fire, as the still living but severely wounded laid there, helpless to what was boring down on them as the Skibidi toilets overran their position, not allowing one to escape. The sun had now completely set on this once prominent location of the world stage. File information. Time: 10 hours 0 minutes and 0 seconds Zulu time. Special Operator, Ryoko Kazumi. Age 22. Blood type O. Measurements 88, 54/90ths of a centimeter. Ryoko sat in position on top of a mid-tier sized skyscraper. Black leather combat boots covered her feet, black opaque stay-top stockings covered her long smooth legs, large knee pads strapped tightly around her knees, a short pleated black skirt with a pink line just above the hem hung down from her waist, A black short-sleeved blouse clad her chest and abdomen. A white sailor collar, or tar flap, rested atop her shoulders, the tassels on the front being blue and knotted up in front of her chest. Black leather gloves clad her hands. Her skin was ultra-fair, almost ethereal-like, eyes blue, her hair long and pink. A mic speaker hovered in front of her lips, the headphone covered by her hair, and finally, a slightly darker pink female Air Force side cap. Across her lap, with her right hand on the pistol grip, sat a Donnell NTW-20, a South African-made anti-material sniper rifle. She sat there, her legs crossed and her back up against one of the building's large ventilation units. She could see smoke and fire off in the dark distance, punctuated by the random explosions, increasing in frequency, intensity, and close of distance. Skibidi, skibidi dom dom, the faint murmuring emanated up from the streets below to catch Ryoko's ears here and there. Ryoko was part of a special operations task force formed just after the Skibidi Toilet invasion. That was the official designation, but calling it a task force was of the utmost generous description. The invasion happened so fast and was so devastating that the militaries of the world were simply throwing anyone that they thought could, or were willing, or sometimes not, to go out and do whatever they could to slow, stop, or gather intelligence on these devious toilets of mayhem. Suddenly, about a city block down and away, Ryoko saw a red flare soaring upwards between the buildings, grayish-white smoke trailing behind as it climbed. Then she could hear the distinct crackle and hiss of the phosphorus burning. A red flare, Ryoko muttered softly to herself. Unable to return. Ryoko stretched out forward, laying down on her front side in the prone position. She crawled to the edge of the building and set up her sniper rifle. She looked through the scope, tracing back the white trail of smoke to its progenitive source. Through the zoom of the scope, Ryoko saw a girl at the end of a large plaza between two skyscrapers. She stood at the end of the guardrail, damaged and leading to a severe drop-off, with jagged debris piled in the area below. The girl stood there, her left arm stretched up high, still smoke from the flare just starting to dissipate. She stood 134.62 centimeters. She wore a long light pink sweater dress with a turtleneck collar, covered in tactical gear strapped around her body. Thick gloves covered her hands, her M4 carbine held across her chest. Tight knee-high white socks covered her shins, black loafers strapped around her feet. Light skin, pink hair as well, long with two X-hair berets hold her hair in front in two tassels, and her brown eyes. I don't want to be a head in a toilet. I don't want to be a head in a toilet. I don't want to be a head in a toilet. The girl repeatedly muttered to herself, the expression of horrific terror draining everything else from her face. The girl stood there frozen, bathed in the red glow of the flare, as flashing blue and red lights flickered in the distance, rapidly approaching, then the faint auditory of sirens amplifying. Down the street cavalcaded police Skibidi Toilets. Black porcelain with enormous red and blue lights reminiscent of those on the roofs of Japanese police cars. The disgusting freakish heads bobbing in the toilet bowls wore official police caps. One could only speculate that they were all once former human police officers, now transformed by the viral Skibidi scourge, and turned to do their unholy, inhuman bidding. The girl prepared to close her eyes and accept her fate when a whizzing snap zipped past her left ear. The Skibidi toilet in front of her cracked and shattered before her, its head and elongated neck flopping in pain and panic on the ground before her as it slowly went limp and expired. The other Skibidi officers' faces became a wash of dismay and grief, before quickly turning to immense rage, focusing on the girl. The toilets moved closer, another snap in the air, and the bloody brains and skull fragment of a head splattered about, quickly followed by another, and another. The toilets, aware that they were under assault, but did not deviate, continuing to move forward. Another round split the air, and missed the head of the next Skibidi. Shit. I missed, growled Ryoko. The bullet missed the head, but connected with a small bulb on the back of the toilet tank, between the police lights, pulling it up as the bullet passed through, piercing a hole through it. The distinct sound of a toilet flushing went off the head, and neck began to violently twist and spin, throwing the police cap off, as a moment later the head was sucked down into the bowl of the toilet. A gurgling sound came from the drain as the entire toilet tipped over onto its side, the police cap spinning around on its rim as it settled onto the ground next to the dead crapper. They can be flushed? Retorted Ryoko to herself, slightly confused. Ryoko sent round after round downrange, smashing through toilet after toilet, most shattering the bowl, and killing the head near instantly. Others occasionally missing the head or bowl and smashing the tank in the rear, requiring a follow-up shot to put the toilet down for good. She took the shots to hit the plunger when she could, flushing the heads, providing confirmation that these creatures could be flushed to kill them. The girl continued to stand there paralyzed with fear. She turned her toes in to point at each other with a gap still between them. She jolted out of her induced paralysis. She raised her rifle up and ejected the magazine. It fell to the ground, landing between the tips of her toes, bouncing with a dull metal clang against the concrete. She then reached into the pack on her left hip and pulled another out and loaded the fresh magazine into the rifle. She chambered the first round, pulled the collapsible stock to her shoulder, and began to fire in bursts. Her marksmanship was spotty, not horrible, but Ryoko could tell from watching that this girl lacked experience. "That's a girl. Keep fighting. We need to save every human we can," Ryoko said to herself. The bullets from the girl's rifle dinged and chipped away at the toilets. The girl was able to put bullets into flesh if the Skibidi got close enough. While Ryoko's heavy anti-material rounds were able to obliterate her targets, one contact with one hit mostly. Ryoko noticed the girl had a comm set on. Ryoko removed her hand from the rifle's trigger for a moment to press the button on her own set over her right ear, hidden under her hair. "Can you hear me?" asked Ryoko. Ryoko heard white noise, static, and silence. "Can you hear me?" she asked again. Between firing bursts, the girl started to hear a crackling in her ear. Just static at first, but then she could make out Ryoko's voice. "Can you hear me?" Crackling through. "Yes? Yes, I can hear you. Where are you?" The girl shouted in exuberant panic as she began to turn and look wildly about, trying to find where her mysterious help was coming from, and losing focus on the threat in front of her. An outstretched head loomed down on her. Her gaze started to turn forward again, seeing the head nearly right next to hers. Too late to bring her rifle to bear, too late to get a clean instant kill shot needed at this range. The head exploded, spattering blood in a streak behind it as Ryoko took it out. "Don't get distracted," chided Ryoko. "You're not out of this yet." More Skibidi Toilets, non-police ones, began to coalesce into the area, reinforcing the police toilets. "What's your name?" Ryoko asked. Mikaru Kozu." "I'm Ryoko. I need you to stay on task, and hopefully there will be a break where you can dash away. Until then, I need you to keep fighting, okay?" spoke Ryoko. "Yes, ma'am," Mikaru stuttered with fear. Ryoko fired off another shot. "Ma'am." "Geez, you make me feel old," replied Ryoko. Mikaru and Ryoko continued to fire. Mikaru unloaded another clip. Her nerves made it hard for her to eject it and load another one in, but she managed. "Miss Ryoko," said Mikaru, "don't let me become a toilet." "If it comes to that, I'll take care of you," answered Ryoko. The fight dragged on. Mikaru covered in cold, nerve-wracking fear sweat. She became hyper-focused on the toilets in front of her. She didn't see the one closing in from her left side. Its long neck stretched out, its mouth open, drool salivating and dripping from its teeth, and eyes set on her smooth, fair, fully exposed thigh. At the last second she saw it out of the corner of her eye, but it was too late. Even Ryoko didn't see it. Then the distinct flushing sound. The head stopped, its eyes wide with terror as it looked back, only to begin to twist and swirl and be sucked down its own bowl. Mikaru turned to see a massive figure in the shadows, release the plunger from his hand, and kick the now dead toilet over. The figure was male, standing just shy of 2.1336 meters. "Gut Nacht. Get es dir gut, Fräulein," he said. The man walked towards Mikaru as the other toilets halted for the moment. She watched him as he emerged from the shadow of the alley, his features illuminating. Short gray shaggy hair, strong chiseled face and jawline, stubble, Caucasian, dull hazel eyes, black dress shirt with a high wraparound collar with a buckle in the shape of an iron cross, light gray well-tailored suit, a bandolier of M67 fragmentation grenades slung across his chest from right to left, a thick, heavy, darker gray trench coat over top, black leather gloves, black leather dress shoes, and a large customized silver Smith & Wesson 629 revolver. Lex Gunther, German GSG-9, he introduced himself. Mikaru. Lex raised his revolver and fired, interrupting Mikaru. She shuddered and scrunched up, even smaller than she already was at the blast and shockwave of the magnum round discharge. The round boring into a skibidi that had taken the moment and thought it had snuck up unnoticed, had eviscerated it, tearing its neck in twain and devastating the porcelain below it. Mikaru turned back and began to burst fire once more, as Lex picked his targets and fired at the skibidis getting in closer. Ryoko continued her support, picking off toilets in the distance. Their gunfire began to quail. As no more toilets poured into the area, Lex broke open the cylinder of his revolver, discharging the spent casings. He reached into the interior of his trench coat and retrieved a moon clip and reloaded the revolver's cylinder before flicking it shut. "You should refresh your magazine," Lex said to Mikaru. Mikaru jolted nervously. "Right," she answered as she ejected the old magazine and replenished it with a new full one. "Where is your support?" Lex asked Mikaru. Mikaru muttered, confused. "The sniper covering you," clarified Lex. "Oh, Miss Ryoko." "I don't know," she answered. Mikaru began to speak into the comm. "Miss Ryoko, what do I do now?" Ryoko let the rifle down, resting it on its pistol grip. She pushed back a little and turned gently on her left side, only to catch a quick racing fear throughout her body, with the accompanying cold, damp sweat. She quickly reached back for the grip of her rifle, but stopped mid-reach, realizing the thing standing a few meters from her was not one of the dreaded toilets. The thing looked like a giant security camera, white exterior, boxy shape tapering off to a hood over the lens, a reddish-pink hue dimly glowing from said lens, 4 legs, one on each corner. They were crude, primitive-looking, just attached to the outside of the camera, rounded at the top, slightly tapering in width near the bottom where they became flat and squared off. Finally, it had a tail of metal braided wire with another smaller camera mounted to the end. It was prehensile and moved more agile and freely. The tail camera looked at her, then surveyed the overall area before the whole thing started to walk away, disappearing over the far edge of the building roof. Ryoko looked around to see more of the faint reddish-pink glow on the rooftops and sides of the adjacent buildings, before they too moved on. "Must be a new drone of some kind," she whispered to herself, relieved. "Miss Ryoko," she heard Mikaru's voice over the comm again. Ryoko reached down and from her waistband pulled out a small square mirror. She slid over to the edge of the roof next to the muzzle of her rifle and leaned out with the mirror. She began to twist the mirror from side to side. "Can you see the light on the top of the building behind you?" Ryoko asked. Mikaru and Lex both turned and looked up, seeing a small, barely noticeable white light flickering at the top of the building. "Yes, we see you," replied Mikaru excitedly. "That's where I am. I need you to come to me," instructed Ryoko. Mikaru looked down at the large drop into the plaza below her and wondered how she was going to get down there. Lex found a break in the guardrail and jumped down to the ground below, his staggering height making the drop only minor for him. He holstered his gun and turned back to Mikaru, putting his arms out, motioning for her to jump, and he would catch her. Mikaru moved forward, the tips of her shoes sticking over the edge of the wall, small chunks of debris and dust getting kicked off. She looked down nervously. She inhaled deeply and jumped off, closing her eyes. Lex caught her around her waist and spun around, placing her on the ground. Mikaru turned to look out of the expanse of the destroyed plaza. Lex pulled his gun back out, and the two began to make their way into and across the plaza. The area was dark and full of rubble, easy for anything to hide and lunge out in surprise. Ryoko watched them through her scope. They made it through without event, and down the first street, coming to the street in front of the building Ryoko was perched atop. Then just off in the distance, they heard the sickening shouts of "Skibidi, skibidi, skibidi." They turned, guns brought to the ready, and saw a group of toilets down the block heading at a woman. Some of the toilets laid in the street already cut down. The woman was tall, at 182.88 centimeters. Japanese, pale skin, long flowing waist-length white hair, crimson lips, heavy thick black eyeliner, gray eyes, black military-style dress jacket, metal guards on her shoulders and neck, metal cincher around her abdomen, black long opera-style gloves, long black ankle-length skirt with a full-length high split right up the front center, revealing her long smooth legs, and thigh-high black boots, and finally she wielded an oversized katana to match her unusual female height, giving her a vague gothic feel and aura. The toilets encircled her as she knelt poised, her left knee on the ground, her right leg outstretched and foot firmly planted on the ground in front of her. Her upper body leaned forward, her left arm and hand turned behind her holding the saya sheath. Her right arm and hand in front of her holding the katana perpendicular to herself, on a flat plane. The toilets moved in, and as they neared biting range of their outstretched necks, the woman whirled about, slicing their heads off with one quick seamless motion, to end up back in the position she started in. More skibidis moved in on her. She turned and stabbed one through the side of the head with the katana. She sliced more heads off of their toilets from just above the seats. The severed heads and necks flopped about like fresh fish dumped onto land as they slowly died. She placed her long right leg onto one of the decapitated toilets and kicked it back, sliding it into more toilets coming her way, smashing and crashing them. Lex motioned to Mikaru, and the two made their way towards the woman, but as they reached her, all the Skibidi toilets trying to assail her had been cut down. She stood straight up. She turned to the right and raised her katana up at Lex and Mikaru as they came close, sensing something was there. As she turned her head to see that they were human, she turned the tip of her katana up and turned to face them directly. "Kuro Silk," she said as she performed Chiburui, flicking her katana blade, dispelling the blood and gore from it. She sheathed the katana in front of herself and held it at her side in her right hand. "Special Task Force," she finished. "Fräulein Nocturne," muttered Lex. Kuro Silk walked forward, one long smooth leg sliding in front of the other as she approached Lex, standing in front of his face, but just off to the left. The top of her head even with his chin. She raised her katana, placing the bottom of its suka hilt against the bottom of Lex's chin. "Woman," she said to Lex. "That is a girl," she said, pointing to Mikaru. "Don't forget it." Mikaru looked at them confused. "Where are you heading?" inquired Kuro Silk. "The rest of her team is at the top of this building," replied Lex, referring to Mikaru. "We were heading to her." Kuro Silk nodded and made her way to the building door, opening it, not that she had to, with all the glass smashed out, with only a few random chunks still in the pummeled frame. She held the door for Lex and Mikaru, and with her free hand motioned for them to enter. Mikaru entered. Lex walked through the smashed-out window next to the door, so he did not have to duck. Kuro Silk let the door go and simply walked through the glassless frame. They stared at the destroyed lobby, all the objects thrown about and covered in filth. Kuro Silk moved forward, her heels clicking on the ground as she surveyed the area. "How do we get to the top?" asked Mikaru. "Do we risk the elevator?" stated Lex. Kuro Silk spied some small lights from coffee makers, computers, fax machines, and other random office equipment. "There may still be power to the building, but it's probably best not to risk it. The power could fail at any moment, and we could end up stuck and trapped." "We'll have to take the stairs," said Kuro Silk. "All the way up?" moaned Mikaru as she hung her head in disappointment. "We also don't know what's hiding in here. The elevator doors could open, subjecting us to one of those things," added Kuro Silk. The group made their way up a grand double staircase to an upper lobby, equally devastated by the destruction. From there, they found the entrance to the stairwell and began to make their ascent. "You know this building is like 100 stories, right?" chimed Mikaru as they made it to the halfway point of the first flight. Lex, in the middle of Mikaru and Kuro Silk, turned back, looking down at Mikaru, placing his hand on top of her head and rubbing her hair. "Complaining isn't helpful or cute," he remarked as he then turned and started back up the stairs. Mikaru puffed out her cheeks and made a face at him before continuing up the stairs as well. They made it to the 20th story, with no incident, being able to keep inside the stairwell. Now the stairwell ended. Kuro Silk slowly slid the door to the office floor open and peered out, scanning the floor covered by the sea of cubicles. She found the entrance to the next set of stairs on the other side, on the adjacent wall. She turned to the others and motioned them to follow. She drew her katana as she crouched walked down the side of the aisle of cubicles, then Lex and Mikaru doing the same. They could hear the faint murmurings of skibidi, skibidi from various spots on the floor. Something was in the dark on the floor with them. Kuro Silk came to the end of the cubicles and stopped dead with fear as she peered around the corner. Right there facing out, looking onto the rest of the floor, was a skibidi. She jerked back her long white hair trailing behind in a wave-like motion as it followed her head back. She motioned for the others to stop and remain quiet. Lex held up his revolver. Kuro Silk shook her head no. She leaned forward once more, raising her katana up. She leered at the skibidi as she silently guided the blade through the air. As the tip neared the head, she quickly stabbed it into the temple. The skibidi's eyes grew wide and mouth agape with the quick shock, and then the head went limp in silence. The toilet was dead. She pulled the blade out and motioned for the others. They rounded the corner and passed the dead skibidi. Kuro Silk, still crouched, opened the stairwell door. She ushered them in and then spun around as she backed in through the doorway, closing the door as she entered. They continued on. Back on the rooftop, Ryoko continued to wait. The ground began to rumble. Then she heard the deep bellowing echoing, skibidi, skibidi, from something gigantic. She peered over the edge of the building to see the titanic skibidi leader. He was gliding into the area below. His voice began to change as he came across all the toilets below killed by Ryoko, Lex, Mikaru, and Kuro Silk. The bellowing skibidi, skibidi now became more angry and rageful. His neck began to stretch and rise up alongside the building. Ryoko's eyes grew large with fear as she lifted her rifle up and took off running. Faster and faster, she desperately tried to increase her speed. She leaped into the air and crashed through the roof access door and onto the landing just inside the tips of her boots, disappearing past the door frame, as the skibidi leader's head and eyes crested of the top of the building, rage filling his face. Ryoko plastered her back against the wall, her knees bent, pulled up to her chest, cradling her rifle as she hid behind the open door. Her breathing became heavier and heavier as the skibidi leader's head was fully above the building, staring down as he moved along, noticing the door ajar. Then the thrumming of helicopter blades became audible as a flight of AH-64 Apache longbow helicopters charged towards the skibidi leader. The skibidi leader turned as AMG-114 Hellfire missiles were released from their rails and careened towards the skibidi leader. His eyes began to glow, charging energy up. Lasers then fired from his eyes, destroying the missiles. He then began to sweep his eye lasers back and forth across the sky, trying to swat the helicopters as he now moved away from the building. Ryoko breathed a sigh of relief but continued to hide inside the roof access door. At the same time, Kuro Silk, Lex, and Mikaru had reached the halfway point of their ascent up the building. Once again, the stairwell had come to an end, and they needed to venture out onto the floor and find the door to the next stairwell. Kuro Silk cracked the door and peered out. This floor was more active, with multiple faint calls of skibidi, skibidi. A toilet slid by. Kuro Silk pulled back until it passed. She stuck her head out and looked about. The sounds of the toilets getting louder and then fading and getting louder. The group darted out their backs against the nearest line of cubicles. As they moved down the line, the silhouette shadows of the skibidis would appear and move along. Looking back towards the large outer windows, they saw 3 skibidi businessmen looking out the window, drunk with ties around their heads, clamoring, "Skibidi, skibidi, skibidi, skibidi," as the skibidi leader moved in front of the building. Kuro Silk's face turned to terror, as did Lex's and Mikaru's faces, as the building shook with the skibidi leader's bellowing voice of skibidi, skibidi, skibidi. The 3 rushed and darted behind the end of the cubicles, their backs pressed firmly against the flimsy corporate dividers, as the skibidi leader's face came even with the windows. The drunk skibidis cheered louder and louder. The skibidi leader's head began to rise up as his neck stretched to the top of the roof, as his voice began to reverberate, skibidi, skibidi, in increasing rage. Then the thrumming of helicopter blades began to vibrate in the air as they came closer. The skibidi leader turned to engage them and moved away from the building. Lex and Mikaru moved quickly to the stairwell door. Kuro Silk stood up and jumped over the corner of the cubicles, and with great silent pace, went back for the drunk Skibidis at the windows. Poising on bent knees down to their height, she turned her blade even with their heads, and thrusted forward, skewering each head one after another in one motion like ripe melons, until all three were on her blade like shish kebab. She drew her katana back out, flicking the blood off and sheathing it in the same motion, as she stood up and turned, dashing and flying directly over each cubicle with her long legs and light body frame. Her last jolt landed her by the stairwell door, with Lex grabbing her by her upper arm and sucking her inside out of view. Lex shook his head at her, and then they continued on up the stairs. "My apologies, I just found it too disrespectful to allow it to go," informed Kuro Silk, as she looked down in regret. The group trudged on their long and arduous trek up the stairs to the top of the building. The going was slow. Hours had passed with near-close encounters. Miss Ryoko," Mikaru whispered into her comm. Lex, now in the lead, turned to Mikaru in the middle. "What are you doing?" "It's been so long," Miss Ryoko may be wondering if something has happened to us. "I wanted to let her know we're still all okay and still making our way up," answered Mikaru. "But all I'm getting is static. The comms have trouble working in buildings with a lot of walls and other structures in them, especially if they're thick," replied Kuro Silk. "I wonder how Miss Ryoko made it to the top," announced Mikaru. "She probably roped in by helicopter, or made her way up before this building became infested." "When the power was still reliable," retorted Kuro Silk. "And the elevators worked," added Lex. Their legs tired and their feet heavy as they clanked on up the stairs. Reaching the next landing, the door to the floor opened in front of Lex. In the doorway, paused in shock, was a Skibidi toilet. Lex was paused as well. Kuro Silk and Mikaru stuck on the stairs. The Skibidi, overcoming its shock neck, stretched out and up with the eye in the head full of shock. "Skibidi, Skibidi dom dom, yes yes. Skibidi, Skibidi dom dom, yes yes," it began to shout as loud as it could, sounding the alarm to the others of its kind on the floor. "Oh fuck," Lex grumbled as he pointed his revolver out and fired, splaying the head in twain down its center to its jaw. He kicked the toilet back as more raced towards the door. Lex slammed the door shut. As he and the others raced past and up the next flight of stairs, the door burst open again just as Kuro Silk passed, and her foot hit the first step of the next flight of stairs. She drew her katana, swinging about, decapitating the first Skibidi through the door. In one smooth, graceful 360-degree spin, and continued her dash up the stairs. The Skibidis were momentarily blocked by their dead comrade in the doorway as they struggled to push through. Mikaru knelt down on the next landing on the adjacent wall across from the doorway in the stairwell. She stuck the barrel of her rifle through the spindles of the railing and began to fire, killing some of the Skibidis, instantly wounding others. Either way, it had the same effect of clogging up the doorway, so they couldn't get through and pursue. Kuro Silk raced past Mikaru, tapping her on the shoulder as she passed, and started up the next flight of stairs. Mikaru didn't move, continuing to fire. Halfway up the next flight, Kuro Silk turned to see Mikaru still firing from the same position, not understanding the signal. Kuro Silk jumped back down the stairs and grabbed Mikaru by the shoulder, pulling her. Mikaru stopped firing and looked up as Kuro Silk began to drag her up the stairs. As Mikaru gained her footing and started to run with Kuro Silk let her go. The Skibidi Toilets pushed through their fallen compatriots. Mikaru watched as the dead and wounded broke the railing and fell off, tumbling down the center gap in the stairwell into the darkness below. "Skibidi, Skibidi," the toilets shouted and cried, sounding the alarm. As the group raced up the stairs, the door on each floor landing erupted right behind them, with more Skibidi Toilets pouring into the stairwell, joining the human pursuit. The Skibidis were slow up the stairs, but with more bursting out of every door on each floor, the group passed. It was hard to maintain a safe distance from them. Now just a few floors from the top, Lex stopped and turned, letting Mikaru and Kuro Silk pass. He pulled a grenade from his bandolier. He pulled the pin and tossed it down to the landing below. He grabbed another one, pulling the pin, and rolled it down the stair he had just come up. The first one exploded, followed by the next one in quick succession, shattering many toilets. Lex turned and continued with Kuro Silk and Mikaru. The loud explosions, shouts, and gunfire reverberated up the shaft of the stairwell. Ryoko both felt and heard the tremendous commotion echoing closer and closer to her position, still hiding just inside the roof access door. She stood up and came to the railing on the small landing, aiming her large rifle out and down at the stairs below her, on as much of a depression as she could. More fear gripped her. The hem of her skirt still swaying slightly back and forth from her recent shift in position. The calamity below her was deafening. Quick single flashes of light, or small rapid burst of light, Ryoko spotted at random spots in the stairwell constantly moving. Then the muttered, angry and horrifying "Skibidi, Skibidi," could be heard en masse echoing up the stairwell. They're coming, Ryoko realized. She closed one eye and looked through the scope with the other, waiting for the gleam of white porcelain to come into her crosshair. Her finger held tight to the trigger. A gray blur came into view a few flights of stairs below. She prepared to fire, then she realized it was human. It was Lex. Lex turned back as Ryoko watched through her scope. He aimed his revolver and unloaded as Ryoko watched the shimmering white blur that was Kuro Silk's hair dart past, followed by the pink dab of color that was Mikaru. Lex flicked the chamber of his revolver out, expelling the spent rounds. He grabbed another moon clip and reloaded it as he took off running again, closing the chamber. The three, now 2 flights below Ryoko, looked up to see her standing there, her rifle trained on them. They stopped and paused. Ryoko removed the barrel from them and pointed it up. The group then finished the ascent up the last of the stairs. Kuro Silk and Mikaru bolted out the door onto the roof. Lex followed, turning to Ryoko. "They're right behind us," he shouted. He then passed Ryoko and darted out the door. Ryoko stood there for half a second, then dashed out the door as well. They slammed the door shut behind them. The group began to push and pile anything large they could scrounge up in front of the door. Broken loose air units, piping, etc. "That door opens inwards," Ryoko said, exposing the problem. The group stood, their weapons at the ready, as they heard the Skibidis slam into the door and continue to bash up against it. The overflow of the massive amount of toilets pushing against the door prevented them from being able to open it for the moment, as the toilets had backed themselves up. Relatively safe for the moment, the group took a breath. Mikaru ran over to Ryoko, hugging her and burying her head in her chest. "Miss Ryoko," came the muffled cries of Mikaru. Ryoko looked down at her, confused, her arms limp at her sides. She then slowly, with some hesitation, placed her left hand on top of Mikaru's head and gently rubbed it. "It's okay. You're safe for the moment," said Ryoko. Lex and Kuro Silk looked at her, confused as well. Ryoko lifted Mikaru by the shoulder off of her. Mikaru wiped her eyes and recomposed herself. "That's not going to hold eternally," said Ryoko. "Who are you two?" asked Ryoko. "Lex Gunther. GSG-9. Kuro Silk, Special Operator. Ryoko Kazumi, Special Operator as well." "What are you special operators? You're the second one I've come across," asked Lex. "They call us that, and officially we're part of the Special Task Force, but the reality is the toilet creature invasion happened so fast and was so devastating, the Japanese military just started grabbing anyone in the ranks that they could do something or was willing to do something, and started to deploy them anywhere trying to hold the line. Most of the time we're just random soldiers fighting alone. Most of us are probably dead by now, never meeting another operator. They basically gave us a fancy name and sent us out on a suicide mission, like the kamikaze pilots of the war long ago. The only difference is we weren't ordered to die, they just expect it to happen," informed Ryoko. "What are you doing in Japan?" she prodded. "International Police and Security Conference." "Then this whole thing erupted," answered Lex. More pounding on the door. The group turned and braced, but the door held and they stood down again. "We have to get out of here and we can't go back that way," said Lex. "How'd you get up here?" he asked Ryoko. "Dropped off. Pick up is at dawn if there's anyone left or able to come back for me, and I assume others still out there," she replied with a sigh as she looked out over the city. The others looked out as well. Smoke plumed from buildings in the distance. Firelight, random massive explosions, and the sounds of destruction enveloped the senses of all of them. The dawn began to break. The vibrant yellows, reds, and oranges lit the skies, adding an eerie beauty to the carnage and destruction below. The toilets still pounding at the door, the sun now cresting over the horizon as the group watched, trapped at the top of the building. Suddenly Ryoko's, Mikaru's, and Kuro's silk cell phones began to buzz and beep. They pulled them out and looked at the message. "Evacuate," read the message. Then an instant later Ryoko and Kuro's silk got another message. "Untenable," it read. Mikaru looking over at Ryoko's phone screen and asked, "What does that mean?" "It means the military is abandoning Tokyo," she interjected with agitation, as she walked towards a bag she had stowed to the side of the roof. "Why didn't your phone go off?" Mikaru asked as she looked at Lex. "Not a Japanese citizen, don't have a Japanese phone, probably not in the system to be alerted," he replied. Ryoko pulled a flare gun from her bag and flare. She cracked open the breech as she walked to the edge of the roof. She slid the flare into the gun and closed it. She climbed onto the border on the edge of the roof. Her skirt flapping in the breeze, she raised her right hand and fired the flare off. A long billowing line of green smoke shot up into the sky in an arcing motion. Moments later, other lines of green smoke arced into the air from around the city in the distance. "Now we pray." "Who's got incense?" said Ryoko as she hopped down off the roof edge. "What? Why?" stammered Mikaru. "You said they were supposed to pick you up at dawn. They have to come and get you." "Right. They promised," shouted Mikaru. Lex turned looking down and away, placing his hand on his head, as he watched the young girl slowly be hit by the weight of reality. Kuro Silk walked over to Mikaru and placed her right hand on Mikaru's left shoulder. "Just because they issued a withdrawal order doesn't mean anybody can get to us to get us out," informed Kuro Silk. "We just have to wait and see," said Ryoko, now on her knees at the edge of the roof praying. "If no one comes, we'll have to get ourselves out, and that is our only way out," Ryoko continued, as she pointed to the roof access door with the massive toilets still clamoring behind it. Mikaru was taken aback by shock. "There's no way we can fight our way all the way back down the building," she cried. "Then I'll keep my promise," replied Ryoko, as she took her prayer position back up. Then on the far left corner of the roof, one of the giant camera machines appeared. Lex was the first to see it. "Whoa, what is that thing?" he shouted, drawing everyone's attention as he aimed his revolver. Everyone quickly turned and looked. "I saw one earlier. I think it's some kind of new drone," said Ryoko. The group relaxed. The tail camera on the machine wagged about, reflecting light as it viewed the situation. Then it jumped down the side of the building and was gone. "What is it, a camera dog?" quipped Lex. Small shimmers started to become visible in the distance. The group strained to see them and make out what they could be. Then the thrumming and chopping sound came through. "Helicopters." "They came," shouted Mikaru excitedly. They could start to make out UH-60 Black Hawk and UH-1 Iroquois Huey helicopters flying in. Suddenly the toilets behind the door became more agitated, and the door began to crack from all the pressure behind it. "They better hurry up and get here, we don't have much longer," shouted Kuro Silk. Ryoko grabbed Mikaru, turning her to her side, and started rummaging through the sack on her hip. Ryoko pulled another flare out and loaded it into the gun. She aimed and fired the green smoke flare. As the helicopters came closer, they could see some had American markings and others Japanese markings. The roof access door cracked more. A Black Hawk helicopter saw the green smoke and moved in and hovered just outside the rooftop edge. The doorman motioning for them to get on. Ryoko grabbed Mikaru and tossed her in. She turned and watched the roof access door as Kuro Silk and Lex climbed in. She scrambled in after. She turned to the side gunner in the window just past the cockpit, manning the M134 minigun. She pulled his left headphone back from his ear and leaned in, her lips almost touching, and shouted, "Light it up," as she pointed to the rooftop access door before falling on her back onto the helicopter floor. The gunner was confused for a brief second, then saw, as the door broke off the hinges and the debris in front was pushed away. A flood of toilets began to pour out the door. The gunner flipped the cover to the arming switch open, placed the switch to the armed position, and pressed down on the butterfly triggers. The electric motor revved, and the barrels began to spin, and a stream of red tracer rounds expeditiously left the barrels, striking Skibidi, after Skibidi eviscerating them into gore and porcelain dust. The rooftop access door was obliterated with the surrounding roof, creating a bigger hole, allowing more Skibidis to flow out. "Oh shit!" shouted the pilot as he yanked on the controls, banking the helicopter up and away. The gunner continued to fire until he was sure they were a safe enough distance from the building. Even the bullet hose reputation of the M134 minigun wasn't enough to make a noticeable dent in the number of Skibidis bubbling up from within the building to the roof. The heads of the Skibidis bobbed up and down as they stood at the edge of the building, shouting at the helicopter. Ryoko grabbed a spare headset from the hook behind the pilot and placed it to her free ear and held the microphone in front of her mouth, blocking the microphone from her other headset. "Are they going to nuke the city?" Ryoko asked. "No, that would look bad. I think the higher-ups feel Japan has been nuked enough in its history. As far as we know, they're just pulling everything back and reconsolidating resources in the countryside for a future push back in. Our orders are to just grab everyone whose location we can confirm either by knowing where they were dropped or green flare location if you moved and didn't pop a flare when the emergency text went out. You're on your own," explained the pilot. "Ironic that it's toilets that have turned Tokyo to complete shit," snarked the co-pilot. The pilot nodded in agreement. Even the Americans aren't nuke Japan happy at the moment. Probably because they're too busy wondering if they should nuke Washington, D.C. The American forces left here are either following their last known orders the best they can or are helping us out the best they can. The further you get away from HQ, the foggier things start to get. The whole chain of command is starting to break down," added the pilot. The pilot turned the helicopter and began to head back. "We're not grabbing anyone else?" asked Ryoko. "You were our only scheduled pickup, and you came with other riders," replied the pilot. Kuro Silk, sitting near the open fuselage door, looked down and saw a man in the street fighting off toilets. She waved to Ryoko to get her attention and then motioned for her to look down. Ryoko moved to the open door and looked down to see. Ryoko looked at Lex sitting next to Kuro Silk. She pointed to him and then back down at the man in the street and then back at Lex again, inferring, "Is he with you?" Lex shook his head no. "We have a survivor 6 o'clock low," announced Ryoko. "Sorry, he's not on our itinerary. Only pickups from known locations." "He's on his own," returned the pilot. Ryoko's face turned sour, as did the rest of her crew. Kuro Silk's blade quickly found its way against the neck of the gunner in front of her, as Lex was on the co-pilot with his revolver. Mikaru trained her M4 on the other gunner, and Ryoko took the pilot with a small tactical knife from her belt. "Everyone we save is one more still in the fight," growled Ryoko in the pilot's ear. Okay. "Unscheduled pickup it is," he replied, as he began to circle the helicopter back, hover over the position, and descend. The man on the street slashed at the toilets with 2 oversized silver push dirks, one in each hand. White gloves covered his hands. He wore a tannish gray trench coat with large cuffs, same color trousers made out of rugged material, knee-high brown leather side lace boots, gray vest over a gray dress shirt, brown leather bandolier across the chest, thick black loose wild rag kerchief around his neck, black sunglasses, and silver combed back hair. The toilets tried to engulf him with sheer numbers. The man with great skill slashed and stabbed in the heads and wiggling wild necks striking at him. One after another he fought them off, kicking the dead vessels back after they had been slain. 3 toilets in a line rushed headlong at him, as a 4th vaulted over top into the air with a grin of evil intent. As it apexed in the air, suddenly it shattered. A second later, the man heard the crack of a gunshot. The 3 toilets stopped their advance, and the others in the vicinity froze. The man looked over his right shoulder, just as the rotor wash from the helicopter blades hit him. He watched the Black Hawk come to a hover less than half a meter off the ground. He saw Ryoko, laying in the prone position, barrel of the rifle sticking out the fuselage door, smoke wafting from the muzzle. She fired off 2 more shots, taking out 2 of the 3 toilets, the one on the right and the one on the left, leaving the center. Kuro Silk sat on the right side of the doorway, her legs resting on the landing skid. She motioned for the man to come to them. He turned back and lunged at the surviving center toilet, stabbing it through the center of its forehead before making the mad dash to the helicopter. Ryoko sat up and pulled her rifle to the side. The man dived in and slid across the floor. The pilot yanked the controls and began to rapidly ascend. The gunners on both sides unleashed the power of their miniguns, devastating any of the toilets, making an attempt to surge at them. As they reached a safe altitude, Kuro Silk pulled her legs in. The man looked around at his rescuers. Ryoko grabbed the headset from behind the co-pilot and handed it to the man. He put them on. "Thanks, I was afraid I'd have to walk my way out of Tokyo," he said lightheartedly. "I'm Jack Takashima." "Are you part of the special task force?" asked Ryoko. "Possible. My sister and I got picked up to help out, mostly due to our family's high level of martial arts skills," he answered. "Oh God, we didn't leave her, did we?" exclaimed Ryoko. "No," replied Jack. "She's not dead, is she?" continued Ryoko. "I don't know. We got dropped off in different locations. So as far as I know, she's still out there," he finished. "I have a sister out there too somewhere," added Ryoko. The nose of the helicopter faced away from the city as the tail trailed towards it. "Get your last looks in, because there goes Tokyo," said the pilot. The helicopter, now far outside the greater Tokyo area, sped along. Other helicopters of various makes, models, and national origins sparsely out in the distant air. Below the helicopter, the green vegetation of the forest below broke to a tan sand soil reminiscent of a desert. Rapidly coming into view was a silver square building. The structure was roughly about the size of a large American retail store. The structure was only 2 stories tall, with an elevated helicopter landing pad on the west side. Helicopters touched down, unloaded their passengers, and took back off. The ground was laced with tire and tread tracks leading into the building. Helicopters landed on the ground, and their rotors were quickly condensed, and they were towed inside as other ground vehicles of all kinds were driven in. Other helicopters circled in the air in a holding pattern, but the one Ryoko and the others were on was cleared right away and smoothly descended onto the landing pad. The helicopter touched down, the wheels barely kissing the platform as it held there. The group exited the aircraft and down the rail-less metal grate stairs adjacent to them. As Jack, the last one off, touched the first step, the helicopter banked left and took off rapidly, the rotor wash blowing and ruffling all their clothes, the girls having to push and hold their skirts down until the rapid onslaught of air passed. They made their way onto the roof. Down near the other end stood a girl, back to them, her black pleated skirt fluttering in the rotor wash as well. She turned, her long brown hair swirling around her. White skin, Caucasian, she wore a white silk blouse with black satin tie held tightly under a black bulletproof tactical vest ringed with magazine holsters around the bottom. Her arms covered in black polycarbonate guards all the way up her upper arms to just below her shoulders. Black hard knuckle gloves shielded her hands. Black thigh-high polycarbonate leg guards covered her legs, leaving only a small part of her thighs exposed just below the hem of her skirt. Her satai ryoiki leading down into her black combat boots. Brown eyes hid behind semicircle black frame glasses. Finally, she held an old original Vietnam War-era model M16 strapped to her chest, barrel pointed down, the rifle butt nearly even with her chin, with 2 Colt .45 pistols strapped to the top of her thigh armor. She began to walk over to the group. When she got close enough, she received them. "Welcome to the box in the middle of nowhere," she said. "I'm Brittany Blanchard. I'm with the company." "Privet military contractor?" inquired Ryoko. "No," answered Brittany. "Would this company be headquartered in Langley?" asked Lex. "Possibly," she returned with a seductive sly grin. "She's CIA," said Lex. "I can neither confirm nor deny that," Brittany answered without answering. Brittany looked up into the sky as her hair started to flail in the air as more rotor wash started to pick up. "Let's get down and inside, it looks like traffic is about to pick up." Brittany led the way down an open trapdoor in the roof, onto more metal grate stairs. Ryoko and the others looking down into the vast interior as military and work crews hustled about moving vehicles, equipment, and supplies. Large industrial elevators loaded up and disappeared down into the depths of the building. Ryoko introduced herself and the others. "We're all part of the special task force except for Lex," she added. The German giant with the angry-sounding accent isn't part of the Japanese special task force against the Skibidi Toilets. "I don't think I would have ever guessed it," said Brittany snarkily. "However, if Miss Hot Seductive Evening Fancy Dress over here wasn't Asian, I might have believed you." "You are way too tall to be Japanese," she said, referring to Kuro Silk. "But the katana might have given it away," Brittany finished as she pulled her glasses down and winked at Kuro Silk, and pushed her glasses back up as she turned her head back, continuing down the stairs. Kuro Silk blushed and quickly shook it off before anyone else could see. Miss Ryoko," muttered Mikaru. Brittany turned and looked at Ryoko to see her response. This was a very unusual way for a clear subordinate to address a superior officer. "I'm not Special Task Force," continued Mikaru. "What branch are you with then, JSDFG?" asked Ryoko. "None, I'm not military," replied Mikaru. The group stopped. Ryoko stared at Mikaru with shock. "Well, this makes things clearer," said Kuro Silk. "She has no concept of certain military signals. She didn't understand what it meant when I tapped her on the shoulder in the skyscraper. She doesn't carry herself like she's had proper training, and she never got the coded withdrawal text like we did when our phones went off back in Tokyo. Only military members would have gotten that." "What about you, Jack?" asked Ryoko. "I got it. They took my sister's and my numbers down after they scooped us up and said don't lose your phones," replied Jack. "Oh yeah, he got drafted without being drafted," said Kuro Silk. "Are you mad at me, Miss Ryoko?" asked Mikaru meekly. No, replied Ryoko as she pulled Mikaru in and hugged her. She then held Mikaru by the shoulders. "But how did you end up like this?" asked Ryoko. "I was evacuating with a group of soldiers and other civilians, but the toilets just kept blocking our way and picking people off. We all had to fight. That's how I got the gun and the gear. Some of the soldiers showed us how to use the guns and some other equipment, but eventually, after several days, I was the only one left. I was left on my own for several days. That's when you found me," explained Mikaru. "Well, you're with us now. You're part of the Special Task Force. You'll be my personal attaché until we find someone to get you a proper rank," consoled Ryoko as they started back down the stairs. "Special Task Force, so special it only has an improper nondescript title, because it was so haphazardly thrown together," came a thick, sultry, seductive French Parisian accent from the flight of stairs below. "Everybody, Sabrina Knight, French military," announced Brittany. Sabrina stood below them looking up. She was short at only 152.4 centimeters and looked even shorter from the distance. Her hair was a light sky blue long down past her waist under her lavender beret, black X-hair barrettes on both sides of her face. Her skin was a pale milk white with bright lime green eyes, light sky blue fingernails to match her hair. She wore a lady shrug half shirt, just the collar, and long sleeves, black with the French flag on the right shoulder, a light gray sleeveless turtleneck sweater under that with its fabric giving the illusion that it was sheer, a strong rugged lavender corset over, a lavender straight skirt with a belt around her waist holding spare magazines. The strap of a satchel bag hung over her shoulders while the satchel itself rested against her backside, her legs smooth and bare down to her knees where she wore brown leather front-laced combat boots. She held a H&K 416 assault rifle in her hands with collapsible skeleton stock, suppressor, forward grip and Picatinny rail system with EOTech Halo sight, Surefire X300U flashlight and ANPEQ-15 laser sight. She scowled at Brittany and then turned with a huff and walked down the stairs. "A rude Frenchwoman, well I never," Brittany joked. "Maybe one day she'll relax and not be so stuck up," continued Brittany. "And maybe one day the long stick will fall out of her ass." Brittany shouted so Sabrina had to hear her. Sabrina let out another soft huff as she stuck her nose in the air and hopped down the stairs. Lex then heard metal clanging. He turned to see one of the camera machines again. Camera dog, he said as it disappeared. Brittany turned to see what he was talking about. Camera dog, she muttered as she just caught a glimpse of it disappearing into the wire and pipework. Is that what you call them? Not a bad name, she continued. Do you know what they are? Asked Lex. Nope, they come and go. They seem to appear out of nowhere. They haven't threatened or gotten confrontational with us yet. They seem like they're helping us, but as far as we can tell, it looks like they're just gathering visual reconnaissance, answered Brittany. So we just ignore them for the most part. Are you the one in charge here? Asked Ryoko. No, the fact of the matter is I don't think anybody is. We have no idea who built this place or even how deep it goes, but it's deep. Assets, supplies, and personnel, military and civilian from all over, keep getting directed here. Somebody was preparing for something, and the toilets may have been it, informed Brittany. She led them down to a loft just above the bustling main floor. They came to one of several partitioned rooms. Inside, at a desk in front of a computer, sat a young man tapping away at a keyboard. Skinny, pale, wearing a dirty gray-brown tank top, baggy jeans, a belt with a large gold-colored buckle with two holsters, one on each side, holding a silver 9mm Beretta pistol. Over top was a brown overcoat with long coattails, black boots. His build was geeky, blue eyes and unkempt green hair. This is my cyber actions officer Steve Wow, introduced Brittany. He spun around in the chair to face them, raised his hands up and pointed at them like his hands were guns. Because I'm here to wow, he said, clicking his tongue afterwards. Lame ass, muttered Brittany as she spun him back around to face the computer. Well, you better have something to wow me, said Brittany. She looked over his shoulder at the computer screen as Steve began to type away again. Nothing really more than what we already have. Whoever is running this show seems to be guiding anyone that's human here and possibly other similar facilities around the world, but I can't confirm the existence of any other locations, and they're just stocking this place with the bandages, bullets, and beans. In other words, everything a large group of people would need to survive long-term and fight a war, said Steve. Brittany placed her right thumb and pointer finger under the nose pads of her glasses and rubbed her nose. Why are they funneling people that aren't Japanese here? Queried Ryoko. I don't mean any offense, but there seems to be quite a few people who aren't Japanese in a military capacity that just so happen to be in Japan and equipped, continued Ryoko. Well, the United States has bases here and a strategic alliance with Japan, so we would definitely be drawn in here in a military capacity, said Brittany. Not to mention we're a superpower or a hyperpower, pick whichever one you like, that has a presence in just about every inch of the globe, she added. Also, Japan is allied with many Western nations and conducts joint military training exercises and hosts many international conferences on military actions and defense. Lex made a silent motion confirming this, as this was a similar reason as to why he was in Japan as he had stated to the group earlier. Then came the clanking of a multitude of boots on the metal grated floor outside the room, gaining in volume, signaling they were approaching. Speaking of people that don't belong in Japan, said Brittany as she turned and looked out the door. Coming down the corridor was a Chinese woman in black military uniform. High collar with gold trim, 6 gold buttons down the front, 3 on each side, a white belt with a Jian sword on her hip, the uniform ending in a flowing skirt, red strips down each side. The sleeves too had red strips down the outside from the shoulders down to the gold cuffs, white gloves on her hands, thigh-high thick black stocking running down her skinny legs to big black heavy combat boot on her feet. A flowing black cloak rested open on her shoulders with a high collar as well with gold trim and buttons down one side. A black officer's hat with red hatband rested on her head with a red hammer and sickle emblem placed prominently on the front center. Her skin pale and fair, her hair long, flowing and black, her eyes gray, and her expression flat. Next to her was another woman, again black uniform but of a lower rank. It was one piece with red strips down the outer arms and torso sections. The white collar of an undershirt poked out with an oblong gold brooch, white gloves on her hands, one holding a brown wooden baton with a looped leather strap on the back of the handle, a black belt with red trim and gold buckle around her waist, opaque black pantyhose covered her legs, and black combat boots on her feet. Her skin fair, her hair flat mid-back length brown and styled up in the front, her eyes golden. Her expression seemed to suggest that she knew something that others in the area didn't. They were accompanied by a group of heavily armed and armored men, all looking alike and indistinguishable from the next. Black tactical masks covered their faces. They had on thick, heavy black jumpsuits with knee and elbow pads and black bulletproof vests. Red strips ran down the outside of their arms and torsos, black tactical gloves on their hands, knee-high tactical boots on their feet. Packs full of gear on their backs, red berets on their heads, and armed with QTS-11 individual integrated combat system, an assault rifle with an airburst grenade launcher. The two ladies entered the room as the men waited outside. Brittany placed her hands on her hips and spread her legs apart, taking a firm stance as she looked at the first woman. "I am Commander Mickey Mao," she said, looking at and addressing Ryoko and the others in the group. She then turned to Brittany. "I thought we agreed you would inform me of any new developments," said Mickey. "Nothing has changed, Ms. Mao. Just some more new arrivals. This is Mickey Mao of the Chinese military, and her second Akon Watanabe," Brittany told the others. "We agreed to nothing. You are not in charge here, Ms. Mao. The only things we have discussed is you not trying to force your will on the other groups here, or overstepping your authority here, which is none," stated Brittany. Mickey scowled. She then turned, her long hair flowing behind her as she motioned to Akon to follow. As she left in a huff, her people following as she continued down the corridor. "Mickey and Akon," said Kuro Silk with apprehension in her voice. "Why would two Chinese women have Japanese names?" asked Ryoko. "Well, the first one has the Mao part right," answered Brittany. "I don't think they're military. I don't think those are their real names. I think they're from a branch of Chinese intelligence. Those uniforms I have never come across before, either in person or photographs. I think they're spies that aren't supposed to be here, and got caught stuck in Japan as the shit hit the fan. And they're trying to act all friendly until they can seize power or get out." She refers to herself as commander, which can be vague when it comes to actual rank. "I get the sense you really don't care for her," chided Ryoko. "Her only concern is what her CCP overlords want. She is going to be nothing more than an undermining force as long as they're here," continued Brittany. "Call me old school, but Americans used to have the proper disdain for communists, but that has seemed to have changed in recent years." Brittany turned back to the group. "Well, that covers the basics over what this place is, and what's going on, as vague as everything is. I'm sure you'd all like to get cleaned up. We're still trying to figure out if this place has barracks somewhere, but as it seems to be essential to Japanese culture, it does have a bathhouse. While you clean up, I can have your clothes and/or uniforms laundered. I'm sure you'd want them back, especially if things here go tits up." Brittany then motioned for them to follow, and led them away. Brittany brought them to the lobby of the baths. "Here we are," said Brittany. "Men to the right, ladies to the left. After you get undressed, just drop your clothes in the baskets in the cubbies, and they'll be laundered. Give it about an hour, and you'll have clean clothes and/or uniforms waiting for you. Also, if you wish, I'll have your guns cleaned and you resupplied with ammunition. Or, other weapons cleaned," continued Brittany, looking at Kuro Silk. Kuro Silk tilted her head slightly with a look of slight confusion as she held her katana in hand. "Oh," she muttered. "I'll clean my own blade, thank you." "Oh, and anyone not culturally used to communal bathing, there are private sento down the side halls on either side," informed Brittany. "Wow, this place is amazing," announced Mikaru. "No, this place is a black box, and I have a feeling we're going to be operating out of here for a long time." "Enjoy," said Brittany as she then walked away. Ryoko and Mikaru walked through the curtain to the women's changing area. Lex made his way past the curtain to the men's changing area. As Jack followed, he felt a tug on the collar of his coat. He looked back to see Kuro Zild pulling him back. He looked up as she towered over him. With her free hand, she stuffed two 10,000 yen notes into his inside breast pocket. "Make yourself scarce and take a private bath, got it?" she said to him as she directed him down the side hall. "You got it," replied Jack. As he walked down the hall and reached into his pocket to check the money, he said to himself, "I wonder if she'd let me watch if I offered to give the money back. It's not every day you get to see two giants going at it." "What was that?" said Kuro Silk, holding the curtain to the changing area about to enter, as she looked down the hall at Jack. Nothing. Forget I muttered anything, stammered Jack as he continued on his way. Meanwhile, Steve continued at his computer station searching for and monitoring information as it came in. He heard the door slide open behind him. He spun around to see Mickey there facing him, as she slid the door closed behind her with Akon standing guard outside. "You're not supposed to come in here," said Steve. "I know, it's just that you're working so very hard, and I wanted to express my appreciation," replied Mickey softly and demurely, as she started to walk forward seductively, placing and sliding one leg in front of the other. "And you're such a big, strong American man, I just find myself enthralled and infatuated with you." Mickey dropped down onto her knees in front of Steve. She placed her hands on his knees, gently pushing his legs apart and moving in closer. "What are you doing? You're going to hurt your knees on this type of floor," said Steve. "Don't worry about me," replied Mickey, as her white-gloved hands reached out and unbuckled Steve's belt. She then took hold of the sides of his pants and gently pulled them down to his knees. She then slipped the tips of her fingers under the waistband of his boxers and pulled them down to reveal his member. She took hold of him with her white-gloved hands, raising him up. "You certainly are a big, rich American man. I hope my small Asian mouth can fit it all," she remarked as she parted her lips and lowered her head down. Steve leaned back in his chair and placed his hands behind his head. Mickey's head bobbed up and down as soft muffled sounds came from her mouth. "I could get used to this sort of Chinese hospitality. Just make sure you work at it as hard as I do," he said. In the changing room, Ryoko and Mikaru stowed their guns, ammunition, and other gear to be serviced. They then began to strip off their clothing. Ryoko removed her knee pads, then her boots. She pulled her cap off. She removed her gloves, then untied her tar flap. She unbuttoned her blouse and slid it off her shoulders and arms. She reached back and unzipped her skirt and let it fall down her legs, pooling around her feet. Finally, she slid off each one of her stockings. Each item tossed into a basket as they came off, leaving her in only her white satin basic bra and panties. Mikaru removed her clothing as well. She pulled her gloves off, then took hold of the hem of her sweater dress and pulled it up and over her head and off her body. She flopped off her shoes and pulled off her socks, leaving her in her basic white bra and panties as well. The two girls then removed their bras and panties, laying them on top of the pile of clothes in the baskets as they entered into the bathing area. Ryoko broke with protocol of washing before entering the bath, and gently eased her body down into the warm water up to her chin, and laid her head back on the edge of the bath and closed her eyes to relax. Mikaru, a little more nervous, followed suit, and entered the warm water on the opposite side of Ryoko, and slowly lowered into the water, sitting in the bath further from the edge, with her knees up to her chin resting on top of them, her lips even with the water, and she started to blow bubbles in the water. On the men's side of the bath, Lex sat nude on a small Hinoki wood stool, washing himself. White suds grouped and bubbled up on his bristling muscles. His broad, wide back and shoulders, massively developed biceps and forearms, well-toned gigantic pectorals, and six-pack abs, not to mention massively powerful legs. Lex glided the sponge down his arms and across his chest. "I'll wash your back if you want me to," came the soft voice of Kuro Silk from behind him. Lex stopped and paused for a moment, then turned at the waist and looked over his left shoulder to see Kuro Silk standing just inside the curtains to the bathing area. Her long, tall body standing there in her strapless shiny white satin bra with lace around the side strap and her tight, firm-fitting shiny white satin thong. She stood there softly rubbing her bare thighs together as she gently twisted her hips while in the entranceway. As Lex watched, she reached behind herself and unhooked her bra, pulling it away from her body, revealing her petite breasts, as she tossed it back into the changing area by the basket with the rest of her clothes. She then reached down and slowly removed her thong, sliding it down her long, smooth legs as her hair cascaded to one side. When she reached her ankles, she slowly stepped out 1 foot at a time. As she stood back up, she tossed her thong back inside as she had done with her bra. She stood there, her tall, pale, slender body on display for Lex to view. Lex turned back, facing away from her. "We have public bathhouse culture in Germany as well. This is not proper behavior," said Lex as he resumed scrubbing his front. Kuro Silk glided forward across the tile floor over to Lex. She sank down onto her knees behind him. She laid against him, pressing her bare breasts against his bare back. Kuro Silk placed her hands on his hips and slid them around Lex's waist. She moved her hands up over his wet, soapy body, her fingers moving up over the deep gullies and high round masses of his rippling abs. Her heart beat faster, her breath began to pant, and passion began to burn in her southern bodily region. She gasped for air as her hands took hold of his pecs, too massive for her hands to hold, as she began to softly kiss Lex across the back of his shoulders and neck. She took the sponge from Lex's hands and began to use it to wash his front side. Lex sat straight up. Kuro Silk could feel the power of his body as she still laid pressed against it. With her breast still against his back, she brought the sponge back around Lex's body and began to wash his back, the soap and water lathering both their bodies. In a flash, Lex turned, taking Kuro Silk, spinning her around and laying her on her back with himself atop her on the warmed, wet tile floor. "So, do I have to sully you more than you already are, or do I take you into the bath and vigorously clean you?" said Lex as he lay on top of Kuro Silk. "Both," she answered. "This is one of the few aspects in my life where I want to be the one who gets dominated, and as a freakishly tall Japanese woman, it's very hard to find a man who is taller than myself, and I don't want to let this opportunity be missed, especially since this might be the last opportunity before the end of the world," said Kuro Silk. "Well, I've seen you in action. You could be Hachishaku-sama," said Lex. "You know the legend." "I guarantee I'll be much more pleasant," replied Kuro Silk. "I won't disappoint. Germans are known for power, efficiency, and attention to detail," returned Lex as he pressed his naked body fully against hers. Kuro Silk gasped for breath as she felt Lex's tremendous German power slide up into her. Her back arched slightly, her bare breasts pushed against Lex's hard pectorals. "Damn, I was hoping to have a shot at that," said Brittany to herself, as she stood just outside the curtains to the bathing area, her back against the wall, hands resting on the stock of her rifle, as she listened to the sounds coming out of the bathing area after sneaking back in. "Oh well, maybe she swings both ways. I always was a sucker for the tall ones, and she's definitely one of the tallest." Brittany picked herself up from against the wall and started to leave when she heard a splash into the bath. Well, I guess it can't hurt staying wet during this type of activity. In the woods far from the compound lay the remains of a set of old concrete stairs. The building they were attached to gone, unknown, if the building had been in one of Japan's many abandoned villages, or if it had been destroyed in the Skibidi invasion. On the demolished stoop sat a young girl, another member of the Special Task Force. File information. Time, 9 hours 30 minutes and 0 seconds, Zulu time. Special Operator, Chio Hayashi. Age 19. Blood type A. Measurements, 30, 24/26 of a centimeter. Chio sat midway up the stoop with only her ankles crossed, her phone in her right hand, and her Herzog HGS-11 held in her left hand, stock resting on the step below where she was seated, and held vertical, her hand around the base of the barrel guard where it attached to the rest of the gun. She wore a lightweight black jacket with yellow trim down the center and around the collar over a white blouse, a short pleated skirt, a red plaid scarf around her neck, the red tails flopped down her back, black fingerless gloves on her hands, black opaque line-patterned tights covered her skinny legs, and black slip-on shoes with a decorative buckle on top covered her feet. Black sunglasses sat on top her head over her short brown hair with two large bangs, one down each side of her face. Her eyes were brown, and a black satchel bag sat at her right side on the step. A small Skibidi toilet glided over the ruins of the stairs. A white bald head with glasses in a white toilet, only about 30 centimeters tall. "Skibidi, Skibidi," it cackled low as it moved in on Chio. Without looking, Chio placed her phone down on her lap, and from the large side pouch on her satchel bag, pulled out a 9mm Beretta M9 pistol, and placed it against the Skibidi's forehead as it reached her. Chio pulled the trigger and fired, killing the Skibidi. She placed the pistol back into her satchel bag. She then picked up her smartphone and stuffed it into her inner breast pocket. As she stood up, she pulled her sunglasses down. She shouldered her rifle and hopped off the stairs and took off running as Skibidi toilets began to emerge from the woods and underbrush. Large flying toilets moved overhead, sailing through the sky, launching smaller Skibidis to the ground. She moved quickly and silently, the tails of her scarf trailing behind her. As she moved, toilets emerged in her path. She fired, pulled the bolt back, and then slid it forward, chambering a new round as the hot spent casing fluttered in the air, being left behind as Chio advanced. The round hit its mark, headshot, splattering brains and skull. She fired again, hitting her mark, as she swiftly moved, calm and deliberate, her breathing steady as a seasoned killer. Chio was able to stay ahead of most of the toilets, dropping in from the air. Chio's path purposely took her perpendicular to the path the gigantic toilet airships were traveling. In short order, she was out of their immediate attention. She stepped behind a large boulder and rested the rifle over it, pointing it up into the sky at the flying toilets in the sky. Skibidi, skibidi, dom, dom, yes, yes, bellowed from the underbrush, and a large group of skibidis slid out onto the path. Chio repositioned herself and pointed the rifle down and fired. At the same time, the sound of automatic fire came from behind her. Chio's round hit its target as the onslaught of automatic fire raked across the toilets, shattering the porcelain bowls, backs, and splattering the heads in short order. Chio pulled the bolt back and loaded the next round as she turned to see where the automatic fire came from. Behind her and off to the right, she first saw the smoking barrel of a black AK-12. Chio looked at the girl holding the assault rifle. "What in the hell are you wearing?" asked Chio, deadpan straight-faced, in her low, soft, monotone voice. The girl stood there with dark navy blue bunny girl ears and bunny girl suit on. Her hair was bobbed, cut in the front and long and numerous down the back, and silver. What little skin was exposed was milky white. Lavender eyes, black spandex shawl covered her hands, arms and shoulders, the white cuffs of her costume over top, as well as the white collar and navy blue tie of her costume. The black fabric magazine holder strapped around her waist pushed her breasts up. A radio communications setup was strapped to the back of her shoulders. Black opaque pantyhose covered her legs. The tactical gear strapped to her legs squished her thighs as large bags hung off of her hips. Finally, black stiletto heels strapped to her feet. I was at a convention when everything happened," she stuttered, embarrassed. Chio spoke not a word back and simply walked past her. "My name is Amiko Ito, Ground Forces," she responded. "Don't care, you look ridiculous." "Get moving if you're going to follow me, otaku girl," replied Chio in an uncaring, matter-of-fact voice. Amiko blushed, her cheeks turning rose red as humiliation washed over her. "Don't call me an otaku," Amiko shouted back in return. "You were at a convention cosplaying in a skimpy bunny girl outfit. You can either shut up and come along, or I can shoot you and leave you for the skibidis," returned Chio. The two headed off, Chio leading the way. "I didn't have time to change, and I had to scavenge all the gear I have," said Amiko. "Don't care," answered Chio. The laundry had returned cleaned and folded, and the weapons had returned cleaned and serviced, reloaded, and topped off with a fresh supply of ammunition to the respective changing rooms from which they had been gathered. Ryoko and Mikaru got dressed and exited to the common area, coming through the curtain. At the same time, Kuro, Silg, and Lex exited through the curtain from the other side. Ryoko's eyes grew wide as she looked at them. Kuro Silk scratched the back of her head as she turned away, blushing with humiliation. Mikaru just looked at everyone, confused. Jack, coming back from the private bath area, broke the tension. Brittany entered to gather them all back up and bring them back to the room where Steve was. As they approached, Brittany saw Mickey finish closing the door with one hand, and it looked like she was trying to wipe her mouth clean with the other, as she and Akon darted away before the group got there. Brittany furiously slid the door open. "What did I tell you about allowing them in here?" she screamed, as she watched Steve finish zipping his pants back up. "What the hell did you do?" she continued, as her eyes went from narrow rage to wide disgust. The others stood behind her, as she noticed small random gooey drops on the floor. The expression on her face turned to ill. "Hey, you know me. They're not going to get any information out of me, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to take advantage of what she's willing to do to try. It may take her a while to figure that out though, but in the meantime, it's not like she left without getting anything out of me. Although I think she may have found it a bit chewy and chunky for her liking," explained Steve. Brittany grabbed her stomach and doubled over, gagging, ready to vomit, followed by Ryoko and Kuro Silk. Mikaru just looked confused again. "First," gagged Brittany, "too much information." Second, go see one of the medics, hacked Brittany. The girls recomposed themselves from the stomach-churning mental image they received. Geez, your reactions are worse than hers. She actually had to have it in her mouth and feel the weight and texture and still act like she was into it to try and seduce me to the dark side, chuckled Steve, as the girls once again had to hold back their vomit-inducing reactions. Steve continued, there's not much of a mess on the floor. I wonder if she's swallow. If you finish that line, there's going to be a massive mess on the floor from the three of us. Just before we end you, growled Brittany. Anyway, yeah, I just played her, reassured Steve. In a maintenance locker, Mickey sat on her knees again, this time leaning over a trash can, her hands bracing herself around the rim as she vomited over and over again. Akan holding her long hair back out of her face. Your sacrifice will not go unrewarded, said Akan to Mickey. Thick, heavy black leather boots clacked on the steel walkway, turning attention away from Steve's disgusting exploits. A buxom woman was approaching them at a quickened pace. The group turned to see her boots were thigh-highs with a white turned-over cuff. The rest of her dress was military style with a black leather low-cut jacket with gold trim and lacing and white cuffs over a black leather skirt, a thin cincher-like garment clasped around her just below her breasts, white dress gloves over her hands, black leather officer cap, thick black neck guard around her throat, white skin, long dark golden hair, crystal blue eyes, and finally a long mantle red on the interior, black leather on the exterior, with white ermine fur tracing the outer edge flowed gallantly behind her from her shoulders as she walked. A Heckler & Koch G11 K2 rifle in her hand. I am not interrupting anything, am I? Her thick Romanian accent and proper-sounding speech chimed out. No, replied Brittany. You returned sooner than expected. I see you have new companions. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Romelia V, of the Romanian Vulturi Special Command Emergency Task Force. Enough with the formal pleasantries now. Spook Brittany, we have situation, that is the meaning of my rapid return. As she spoke, camera dogs began darting by in rapid numbers. Romelia led the way as the group made it to the roof, joined there by Sabrina, Mickey, and Akan with their troops. They watched as the camera dogs raced across the ground and disappeared into the woods in the direction of something in the distance. As the group looked out, they came to the realization that a large force of Skibidi Toilets was heading their way. A deep sinking feeling took over in the pit of Brittany's stomach. Well now, what are we going to do? Came a voice with a soft London accent. Standing next to the group back facing the oncoming threat, leaning up against the wall with his elbows resting on it, was a man. His hair short, shaggy and white. He wore a headset and black sunglasses, a drab olive-green bubble vest over a tight long-sleeve turtleneck shirt, black gloves, tactical gear strapped to his arms and chest, pants in the same color as his vest, pouches hung off his belt, and black combat boots. He held an L85 rifle in his right hand. He stood up straight and placed his rifle over his shoulder and behind his head as he looked at the group. Jin Smith, pleasure, he said. Brittany, all incoming traffic is being diverted to other locations, shouted Steve as he looked down at his handheld tablet. Jin turned to look in the direction of the incoming toilets, then at Kuro Silk, as he stood next to her. Well, at least this time I know there's a show coming, unlike last time in the bath, remarked Jin. Kuro Silk stood there, then her eyes grew wide and she blushed, her fair face turning a slight pink. You were in there? She asked hesitantly. Oh yes, he responded with a smirk. Her face turned to full rose red. You really should scan your surroundings before committing, but it was one hell of a nice-looking performance. Bath and a show, he chuckled as Kuro Silk looked down and away, grasping her katana with both hands in front of her, standing stiff and up straight. Brittany, hands on the ledge, looked down at the ground, her eyes hidden in the shadows from her bangs. She stood silent for a moment, her hands clenching the concrete ledge. Soft lockdown, she said so low almost no one heard her. Steve and the others looked at her, she spoke again, the same low audible, and no one could make it out again. Finally, she looked up and out at the coming terror. Soft lockdown, she ordered loud enough for everyone to hear. Get everyone that's outside inside. Everybody that's combat capable on standby and ready to go. Steve pressed a button on his tablet, and a soft, low beeping pinging began to echo out the facility. Everyone paused for a moment. The lockdown began. I now need to ask if you standing here before me are willing to head out with me. I plan to play decoy, to try and lead the main Skibidi force away and around this building's location. Yes, answered Ryoko, with Mikaru hesitant, holding Ryoko's arm. Nodded her head yes. Always with you, said Steve. Why not, answered Jin. Of course, my blade is ready, answered Kuro Silk. As the others all pledged to go as well. Mickey stepped forward with Akon. We shall accompany you as well, as will my men, said Mickey. Vehicles roared out of the massive doorways in the building, as the clanking of heavy metal doors took over as they rolled shut behind them. 3 Dongfeng EQ 2050, Chinese reverse-engineered copies of the American Humvee, sans their top covers. The first driven by Mickey, with Akon in the passenger seat and 3 of their troops in the back. The other 2 manned by more of Mickey's troops. 2 Humvees, one driven by Brittany with Ryoko, Mikaru, Kuro Silk, Jin. The other driven by Lex with Steve, Jack, Romelia, and Sabrina. 3 old U.S. Army Jeeps with other volunteering troops flanked alongside as they raced out. They raced across the dry dirt, kicking up dust, before slipping into the dirt roads into the woods. Brittany put a CB radio microphone to her lips. The plan is to cut south and then back up. Let them spot us, then head south again and try and lead the column away, she spoke. As they raced through the woods, Mickey and her troops took a dirt path running parallel to the others, and sight of them became interspersed with trees until they could no longer be seen. The vehicles hit their pivot point and began to make their way north and straight for the toilets. Toilets began to strike out from the undergrowth, slamming into the vehicle and bouncing off. Above in the sky, one of the larger toilets spotted what was happening and let out a cry. Skibidi, skibidi. All of the toilets in earshot turned, looking down to see their comrades on the ground fighting against the small convoy of vehicles heading for the main column. The group let out a collective cry. Skibidi, skibidi. As they turned, the small to medium-sized skibidis diving down, as the larger skibidis and transports remained high to provide air cover. That's it, we've got their attention. Turnabout, shouted Brittany into the radio. The group cranked the steering wheels over hard and began to speed away as the toilets dropped all around them. Dirt plumes exploded up as the toilet's aerial onslaught continued. Echoing screams of Skibidi, skibidi came from all sides. Automatic gunfire bursts flashed from the vehicles. A long neck stretched out and plucked one of the Chinese soldiers from Mickey's Dongfeng EQ 2050, tossing him back into a group of skibidis who proceeded to tear him asunder. A large vehicle-sized skibidi dropped next to one of the jeeps, the impact sending it spiraling into the air. Its occupants flung out and scattered on the ground. The skibidis pounced on them like hyenas, dragging them away. Some of the soldiers managed to fire off bursts or stagger to their feet and fire off a burst, but it didn't matter, they were all quickly overtaken, as the group was quickly left behind by the rest of the convoy. The kilometers flew by as the convoy raced south, drawing the flying column of toilets away. The plan was working, but the amount of skibidis was becoming overwhelming. They had lost the one full jeep of men, and another plucked from one of the Dongfeng. Everyone that was not driving was firing wildly out of the vehicles, trying to scrape the skibidis away as they rammed and bashed the sides of the vehicles. A V-shape of skibidis emerged in the distance, heading straight for the Humvee Brittany was driving. The smashing of porcelain and the splattering of blood could be heard as she rammed full speed into them. The front end of the vehicle smashed, the radiator leaked coolant, the vehicle began to smoke and lose power. Flames erupted from under the hood as the vehicle stopped. Kuro Silk leapt out the back, slicing down several pursuing skibidis. Ryoko dropped the bipod on her rifle on the trunk of the Humvee and began firing, dropping several skibidis. She turned her sights on one of the larger flying toilets and began firing. After taking several rounds, it began to list to one side and crash to the ground. Brittany dismounted as well and took up a firing position just outside the door. She looked up at the coming toilets and realized the whole column had pursued them. Well, I think my plan worked better than expected, she said. Lex turned the Humvee he was driving and slid to a stop perpendicular to Brittany's disabled one. He pulled out his revolver and began firing. The tires on Mickey's Dongfeng EQ 2050 shredded on the shards of broken porcelain, blowing out all 4 tires. The vehicle began to sway wildly and lose control, tossing the soldiers in the rear from their seats and out onto the ground. Mickey controlled the vehicle long enough to bring it to a stop. A massive skibidi landed on the front end, crushing it, as Mickey and Akan jumped out and ran. The 2 remaining Dongfeng EQ 2050s encircled the disabled one, and the soldiers jumped out to dispatch the massive skibidi and protect Mickey and Akan. The U.S. Army jeeps bringing up the rear were now fast approaching skibidis in hot pursuit. The skibidis slammed into the rear of one, causing it to fishtail and slam into a large rock. The skibidis were on the occupants before they could recover. If any had survived the crash was unknown. It all happened too fast and slaughtered them all. The last jeep had a skibidi leap onto the hood, and with its long neck reach around and pull the driver out and toss him under the front of the jeep. The soldier in the passenger seat quickly leaned over, head and arms down by the pedals, and slammed on the brake. The skibidi flew off forward, smashing on the remains of the first jeep, before this jeep slammed into it as well at a reduced survivable speed. The soldiers then ran to Mickey and the others. The survivors then realized they were in a large dirt clearing. The skibidi advance slowed, and their sickening cry grew in number and volume as they slowly slid forward. "What do we do now?" cried Mikaru. "I don't know," answered Brittany in a low voice. "Well, who's ready for that blaze of glory?" said Jin as he leaned over the hood of the Humvee ready to fire. Skibidis burst forward, chomping at them, held back by the vehicles, now being used as barricades. They fought the toilets off, but not before they were able to disable the remaining working vehicles. Kuro Silk sliced the head of a skibidi off as it stretched around the rear of the Humvee. She then kicked it away, only to hear the scream of 2 of the soldiers from the jeep, as they were snagged and dragged off before anyone could help. Then the muffled screams of some of the Chinese soldiers, as they too were grabbed by the heads on outstretched necks and dragged out into the wasteland between the toilets and the humans. More necks outstretched as the heads reached in a large group and bloodily disemboweled the soldiers. The skibidis formed a line, large vehicle-sized ones in front, with the normal-sized ones coming up behind, their final push. "This is it," shouted Jin. Ryoko stroked Mikaru's hair as she pulled out a side arm and aimed it at the back of Mikaru's head, ready to make good on her promise. Brittany drew her pistol as well and held the barrel against her right cheek, contemplating what she was going to do. Massive explosions then rocked the toilets in front of them, stunning the toilets and injuring a few of them. Behind the group on a grass-covered dirt berm stood a man dressed in tight-fitting black tactical dress with protective guards. Medium-length brown hair, brown eyes, white skin. He held a M32A 140mm MSGL, multiple-shot grenade launcher. The round spent, he dropped it to the ground and picked up a Heckler & Koch MP5 submachine gun with suppressor and Picatinny rail. He began firing in bursts. He fired, stopped, aimed in another direction, fired, burst again, and again, picking off the normal-sized skibidis as he advanced down the berm. The skibidis still stunned from the grenade attack, some of the large ones dead or wounded. He advanced methodically, picking his targets. He stopped firing and lowered his gun and stood up straight. "On me, on me, on me," he shouted. He raised his gun up again and fired off bursts, again picking off his selected targets. The group looked at each other for a split moment. Brittany nodded her head, and they all took off running towards the man. Then Mickey and her troops took off running towards him as well. He fired one more time, draining his magazine. He turned the gun and pressed the release, pulling the spent magazine, steam bellowing out, wafting into the air. As he swapped his magazines, the skibidis seized on the momentary lull and took it to their advantage. They outstretched their necks, seizing 2 more of the Chinese soldiers. The one grabbing Mickey's ankle before he was yanked away, tripping her and knocking her to the ground. Flat on her stomach, she turned over and sat up just in time to see her soldier dragged away screaming behind his comrade that was taken first. Akan grabbed her by the left shoulder and pulled her up Mickey's legs, struggling and scrambling for footing as they began to run again. Sabrina in the rear of the group felt a massive pain in her right ankle, and then a powerful pull sending her face down to the ground, As she took her face out of the dirt and looked forward, she felt the terrifying pull. She was being dragged back into the skibidis. She felt the helpless terror, unable to turn and bring her gun to bear. Then she heard a shing and the pull stopped. Kuro Silk had sliced the neck of the skibidi. Sabrina turned over and kicked the still clenched severed head off of her ankle. She rubbed and examined her boot and ankle. Kuro Silk stood over her looking down. "It's okay, I'm okay, it didn't bite through my boot," she declared. Kuro Silk knelt down and smacked Sabrina's hand away from her boot. She grabbed Sabrina's ankle and gave it the once-over herself. Finding no puncture marks, she nodded that Sabrina was good. She stood up and grabbed Sabrina by the collar, lifting her up. "Sacre bleu," shouted Sabrina. "Be gentle with me, giantess," as Kuro Silk dragged her away. The last of the group behind Kuro Silk and Sabrina reached the man, but the skibidis picked one last member off, biting down on one of the jeep soldiers right where the shoulder and neck meet. The look of shock and terror overtook his face as the others watched, and in the same motion, the skibidi ripped him into the air and back into the lingering smoke and confusion. The man clicked in a new magazine, loaded the first round into the chamber, and began firing again. The previous all happening in those few terrifying split seconds of him exchanging magazines. The group behind him, as he continued cover fire, he stopped. "Over the berm. Over the berm," he shouted his order to them. The group scrambled over the grassy dirt mound and dropped down the other side. He fired a few more bursts before he stopped, holding his gun down and across his chest. In his other hand, he raised up a remote. He smiled at the oncoming toilets as he pressed the button, slowly walking backwards up the berm until he stood on the crest of it. Half a dozen white lines shot up in the sky from behind him, and the others swaying and wiggling in the air as they outstretched over the skibidis. "Miklek," mumbled Brittany. They were M58 mine-clearing charges. As they began to descend, the man dropped behind the berm, with the others crouching down and covering his ears. The others followed suit. The lines hit the ground, exploding on contact, obliterating the skibidis, large and small, on the ground in front of them. The ground trembled, and massive smoke and fireballs rose into the sky. The man poked his head over the berm, the others following slowly to take in the scene of massive carnage before them. Shattered bits of porcelain, some large from the massive skibidis, and charred severed heads and necks, smoking and burnt to a crisp, all in the matter of a single moment. "Ben Wright, Black Ops," he said. "Brittany Blanchard, I'm with the company," she responded. Ben nodded back. Out beyond the sea of death and destruction, the group could hear the angry shouts of the toilets as they began to move once again, pushing through the remains of their now obliterated compatriots. "They're unstoppable," said Romelia. "You have any more line charges?" asked Brittany. "Negative. Those were the last of what I had. They were here when I got here about a week ago. I received orders to use them to start clearing paths in the forest to use as makeshift roads to some building in the direction that you came from," said Ben. "That's where we came from," said Mickey. "That aerial formation was going to fly right overhead. I decided we need to draw it off before the Skibidi Toilets found it," added Brittany. "Well, mission accomplished," responded Ben. "However, you may have put yourselves in a different peculiar situation," he continued. "But maybe you can fill me in on what is actually happening." "Nope, we're in the same boat as you," said Brittany. "We were all either ordered to the site or brought there by someone who was ordered to bring us to the site." "Well, that sucks," Ben replied. The white streak of a contrail traced across the sky. It erupted in a massive explosion in the side of one of the gigantic toilets. Then more contrails smacking into the side of the giant toilet, causing it to groan as it turned to the left and began to crash. The contrails of more missiles exploded on the smaller toilets, destroying them and damaging the transports, causing them to start to crash. The raking of machine gun fire could then be heard pinging into the porcelain toilets. American fighter jets, mainly F-35Cs with some other fighters, screamed in peel up and off at the last possible moment. The toilets in the air scattering without orders or cohesion to engage the fighters in a massive aerial dogfight. This distracted the toilets on the ground, their attention now on the attack from the air. "Time to bug out," said Ben as he motioned for everyone to follow him. He led them back into the woods and past the M58 launchers, now empty. He came to a nondescript patch of long flattened grass. He knelt down on one knee and under the grass, grabbed a handle twisted, and opened a hidden trapdoor in the ground. "This is where I've been holding up," he said. "Here you go, everyone inside." "You set this up yourself?" asked Lex. "No, like your mysterious building, it was here for me when I got here," informed Ben. "I'm not sure about this," pipped up Akon. Mickey's head spun around and glared at her seemingly for expressing her own unfiltered thought before getting Mickey's approval or reinforcing an already approved narrative. Burning toilets began to fall from the sky and crash into the ground. Eye lasers ripped through the air after the planes. The falling flaming debris began to get larger and closer. Finally, a burning toilet collided with the ground and rolled past the group. "You can all wait outside if you want, but I'm going inside," said Ben. Akon nodded, ready to enter. Mickey pointed to the hole, ordering her soldiers forward. They entered first and the surviving soldiers from the jeep. Then Mickey and Akon. "It's starting to get hot out here," shouted Jack. Kuro Silk entered next, her long slender body slipping down into the hole as the others followed suit until only Brittany and Ben remained on the surface. Brittany slipped her legs into the hole onto the ladder, hidden just inside until she was waist deep. She looked back and up at Ben. "Time to close the shop," said Ben. Brittany continued down the ladder. Then Ben entered, grabbing the hatch as he climbed down, taking one last look at the destruction occurring above before he closed and locked the hatch, the grass covering it looking like it was never there. He dropped down to the interior. Those with lights on their guns had them on. Ben reached over and turned the lights on. The others turned theirs off. The cold drip of water could be heard in the distance, the hiss of steam from the walls of pipes that made up the room. On the ground was random gear, supplies, and some of Ben's personal belongings. Corridors stretched off into the darkness. "Where do these go?" asked Ryoko. "I don't know. I haven't had time to do any reconnaissance," replied Ben. "Do you think it could reconnect back to the facility?" said Mickey to Brittany. Brittany, reluctant and not wanting to answer her, said, "There is a good possibility." The ground above them began to tremble and shake as the fallen began to crash down. They all looked up, unable to see, but able to feel the battle above. "Well, everyone settle in. We're here until we can make our next move," stated Brittany. To be continued.